Emily, we've decided Christmas this year is for successful family members only. It's no place for losers. My mother's voice came through the phone with the casual cruelty of someone commenting on the weather, and I stood frozen in my modest apartment, the words hitting me like physical blows, even though some part of me had been expecting this for weeks, maybe years if I was honest with myself. I was 29 years old, a third-grade teacher at Lincoln Elementary, and I had just become the first person in my family to be explicitly uninvited from Christmas, though the exclusion had always been there in subtler forms, in the seating arrangements, and the dismissive comments, and the way conversations stopped when I entered rooms. "Mom, I don't understand," I managed to say, though that was a lie because I understood perfectly. I had always been the disappointment, the one who didn't measure up to my sister Rachel with her corporate law career and six-figure salary, or my brother Marcus, who was a surgeon at Johns Hopkins, both of them with the right kind of ambition, the kind that came with prestigious titles and impressive bank accounts. My mother sighed, that particular sigh she reserved for explaining obvious things to slow children. "Rachel and Marcus have accomplished so much, and we want this Christmas to be a celebration of success. You understand, don't you? It's nothing personal, Emily. It's just that we have limited space, and we want to focus on family members who've really made something of themselves." Limited space. They had 8 bedrooms at the lake house. I looked around my apartment. All 600 square feet of it, the second-hand furniture I'd collected over years of teachers' salaries and student loan payments, the stack of papers I'd been grading on my coffee table because my students deserved feedback, even if their teacher was apparently too much of a failure to deserve a seat at her own family's Christmas table. "I'm a teacher," I said quietly, hating how defensive I sounded, how small. "I know, honey, and that's very nice. But let's be realistic about what that means in terms of achievement. Maybe next year you'll have something to celebrate and we can include you then." She said it so matter-of-factly, as if she were doing me a favor by being honest, as if her words weren't carving out pieces of whatever self-worth I had left. I thought of every family gathering where I'd been introduced as our other daughter, while Rachel was our daughter the lawyer, and Marcus was our son the surgeon. Every dinner where my stories about my students were interrupted because they weren't as interesting as Rachel's latest case or Marcus's surgical innovations. Every year of being compared and found wanting. "I have to go, Mom," I said, and ended the call before she could say anything else, before I started crying and proved her right about my weakness. The apartment felt smaller than ever, closing in around me as I sank onto my worn couch and looked at the family photos on my bookshelf, wondering when exactly I had become the family loser, and worse, wondering if maybe they were right. The pattern had been established long before that phone call, woven into the fabric of my family's dynamics so thoroughly that I sometimes wondered if I had imagined a time when things were different, when I was valued for something other than being a convenient comparison to make Rachel and Marcus look even better. I remembered Rachel's wedding 3 years ago, when I was 26 years old and still trying to convince myself that my family's treatment of me was normal, that all families had hierarchies and I just happened to be at the bottom of ours. The wedding had been at the Riverside Country Club, an elaborate affair with 200 guests, ice sculptures, and a live band that cost more than I made in 6 months. And when I arrived, I discovered my name card placed at the children's table, squeezed between Rachel's friend's 7-year-old twins and a fidgety 9-year-old who spent the entire reception kicking my chair. "There must be some mistake," I had said to the wedding planner, showing her my card, and she had checked her clipboard and shaken her head. "No mistake. This is where the bride seated you." I had eaten rubbery chicken next to coloring books and juice boxes while my parents sat at the head table, while Marcus gave a toast about Rachel's brilliance and ambition, while everyone celebrated the golden child, who had never once invited me to be part of the wedding party, who had looked right through me when I asked if there was anything I could do to help, who had said, "I have my real friends for that." Then there was Marcus's promotion party 2 years ago, held at my parents' house. where my father had introduced me to his colleagues as our other daughter with a dismissive wave of his hand, the emphasis making it clear that I was the afterthought, the one not worth elaborating on. This is Rachel, our daughter, the corporate lawyer at Henderson and Associates, and Marcus, our son, the surgeon at Johns Hopkins, he had said, his voice full of pride. And then, almost as an afterthought, and Emily, as if my name alone was explanation enough for why I didn't merit further description. I had spent that evening refilling drinks and clearing plates like hired help while Rachel held court about her latest case, and Marcus described a complicated surgery. And when I tried to share a story about one of my students finally learning to read after months of struggle, my mother had literally turned her back to me mid-sentence to ask Rachel about her bonus structure. The family dinners were worse in some ways because they were regular, a monthly ritual of slow erosion where I showed up hoping this time would be different and left feeling smaller than before. "How's the little teaching job?" Rachel would ask, her tone making it clear that teaching 8-year-olds was barely employment at all compared to her work negotiating multi-million-dollar contracts. "Still playing with crayons?" Marcus would add, and my parents would laugh like it was affectionate teasing instead of casual cruelty, like I was being too sensitive when their words landed like punches. A week after my mother's phone call, the formal Christmas card arrived in my mailbox. Thick cream cardstock with embossed gold lettering that announced the Chen family Christmas celebration. And when I opened it, my hands were shaking because some part of me had been hoping it was all a misunderstanding, that she would call back and apologize, that I would find an invitation inside meant specifically for me. Instead, the card was addressed to Rachel, Marcus, and families in my mother's elegant script, my name conspicuously absent like I had been erased from the family tree entirely. And I stood there in my apartment holding this beautiful, expensive card that proved my exclusion wasn't accidental or temporary, but deliberate and formal enough to print on cardstock. I made the mistake of checking social media that evening, scrolling through my family's posts because I couldn't help myself, even though I knew it would hurt. And there was Rachel posting photos of the lake house with captions about intimate family Christmas with people who matter, and my mother commenting with heart emojis, and Marcus sharing memories from last year's celebration with "can't wait for this year with my favorite people." And each post felt like another confirmation that I was not wanted, not valued, not family enough to matter. The next day at school, my colleague Sophia found me crying in my classroom during lunch, surrounded by my students' drawings and spelling tests, and she closed the door and sat down beside me and demanded to know what was wrong. And I showed her the card and the social media posts, because I was too tired to pretend anymore that my family's treatment didn't devastate me. Sophia looked at the card with such anger in her eyes. This fierce protectiveness that made me cry harder because it was more care than my actual family had shown me in years. And she said, "Emily, this is abuse. You know that, right? This isn't normal family dynamics. This is cruelty." Then she noticed the stack of unopened mail on my desk, official-looking envelopes I had been avoiding for weeks, and she asked what they were, and I said probably just more student loan notices or bills I couldn't afford, more evidence that my family was right about my failure to launch, my inability to achieve the kind of success that mattered. Sophia picked up the envelopes, and I could see they were from law firms and investment companies, not the usual collection agencies, and she said, "These don't look like bills, Em. When did you last actually open your mail?" I admitted I had been avoiding it since my grandmother's estate lawyer had contacted me months ago about some inheritance, but I had assumed it was probably some small sentimental item, maybe her nursing pin or some costume jewelry. Nothing significant because my grandmother had been just a nurse, according to my family, someone who worked hard but never accumulated wealth, never achieved the kind of success my family valued. But Sophia was insisting I open the letters right now, saying that lawyers don't send multiple certified letters about costume jewelry, and I was resisting because I was so afraid of more disappointment, more evidence that even my grandmother's love couldn't translate into anything substantial. but Sophia literally put the first envelope in my hands and told me she wasn't leaving until I opened it. And so, with shaking fingers, I broke the seal and pulled out the letter inside. And the first words I saw were, "Final settlement of estate," and a number that made absolutely no sense, so large that I thought it must be a mistake, or maybe the total value before taxes and fees and debts. But as I kept reading, my vision blurring with tears, I realized this was real. This was actually happening, and my grandmother had left me something far more significant than a nursing pin. The first letter confirmed that my grandmother's estate had finally cleared probate after 2 years of legal complications, settling disputes with distant relatives who had emerged from nowhere claiming they deserved portions of what she had left behind. And the lawyer's firm language made it clear that the will had been ironclad, that every dollar had been explicitly designated for me and me alone. And as I read those words, I felt something crack open inside my chest, some fragile hope I hadn't known I was carrying. The second letter detailed an investment portfolio that had been established in my name when I was born, managed quietly by my grandmother for 29 years. And the list of holdings read like a foreign language: stocks and bonds and mutual funds that had been carefully selected and rebalanced and grown through decades of patient strategy. And I kept staring at the numbers beside each entry, the values that seemed impossibly large, and Sophia was reading over my shoulder and saying, "Oh my God, Emily, oh my God," over and over while I sat frozen, trying to process what I was seeing. The third letter contained a property deed to my grandmother's cottage in Vermont, the place where I had spent childhood summers learning to fish and pick berries and sit on the porch reading while she told me stories about her nursing career. And I had assumed the cottage had been sold after she died because no one in my family had mentioned it, because properties cost money to maintain, and my family always said grandmother had lived charmingly modest, which was their polite way of saying poor. But here was proof that she had owned it outright, and now it was mine. This place filled with the only unconditionally happy memories of my childhood. The fourth letter was the final accounting, the number that made everything real, that transformed this from some administrative formality into a life-altering reality. And when I saw it, I actually laughed because it was so absurd, so impossible, so completely contrary to everything my family had always believed about my grandmother's financial situation. $2.3 million in stocks, bonds, real estate, and carefully accumulated savings, and I read that number at least 10 times before I could even speak, before I could do anything except stare at the page and try to understand that this was real, that I was suddenly and inexplicably wealthy in a way I had never imagined possible. Sophia was crying and hugging me, and I was just numb, holding this letter that explained how my grandmother had started investing in medical companies in the 1970s and 80s when she saw which innovations were changing healthcare, how she had lived simply and saved aggressively and made smart choices year after year because she wanted to give me something my family never had, which was the freedom to live according to my values without fear. And there was more. Another paragraph about an additional trust specifically designated for educational purposes that held another $500,000. And the lawyer's note explained that my grandmother had been adamant this money should support my work with children, whatever form that took, because she believed education was sacred and I was doing sacred work. Tucked into the final envelope was a handwritten letter from my grandmother, written in her careful script during her last weeks, and the paper was wrinkled like it had been folded and unfolded many times before being sealed away, and I could barely read it through my tears, but I made myself focus on every word because this was her voice speaking to me across death, telling me things I desperately needed to hear. "My dearest Emily," it began, and just those 3 words broke something in me because she was the only person who had ever called me dearest, who had ever made me feel genuinely treasured. And she wrote about watching me grow up and choose teaching despite my family's disapproval, about how proud she was that I had selected richness of purpose over richness of wallet. But then she wrote the words that I would carry with me forever. But you deserve both, my darling girl. You deserve security and freedom and the ability to make your dreams real. This money is my way of telling you that your life has worth, that your choices have value, that you are exactly who you should be, and now you can help others become who they're meant to be too. The instructions were simple. Use the money for my dreams, whatever they might be, trust my own judgment, live fully, give generously, and never let anyone make me feel small again. And she signed it, your grandmother who sees you. And that phrase destroyed me because it was true. She had always seen me when my own parents looked right through me. She had valued me when my siblings dismissed me. She had believed in my worth when I couldn't believe in it myself. I was sobbing now, grief and validation and confusion pouring out in waves while Sophia held me, and I was mourning my grandmother all over again, missing her with an intensity that felt like drowning, wishing she was here so I could thank her and tell her what this meant, and ask her why she never told me, why she let me struggle and doubt and suffer when she could have helped. But even as I thought it, I understood. I could hear her voice in my head explaining that I had needed to choose teaching freely, to know my own strength, to build my life on my values rather than her money. And this inheritance wasn't rescue, but reinforcement, not salvation, but validation of choices already made. Sophia was talking rapidly about what this meant. About paying off my student loans and buying a house and never worrying about car repairs again. Practical, wonderful things that I couldn't quite focus on because I was staring at my grandmother's letter and thinking about what my family would say when they found out. How they would react to learning that the grandmother they had dismissed as just a nurse had accumulated more wealth than any of them, that the granddaughter they called a loser had inherited a fortune while they got nothing, and some dark part of me wanted to see their faces, wanted them to know they had been wrong about everything. But mostly, I just felt sad that my grandmother was gone and couldn't see what I would do with this gift she had given me. My first thought wasn't revenge or vindication, but the children's literacy program I had been dreaming about for years, the intervention system that could catch struggling readers early and give them intensive support before they fell too far behind. And I was already mentally calculating costs and logistics because this inheritance meant I could actually do it. I could fund something meaningful and lasting that would change lives. But Sophia was watching me with this knowing look, and she asked the question I hadn't let myself consider. Are you going to tell your family? And suddenly I realized they didn't know, that the estate settlement had been private, and my grandmother's will had never been discussed with the broader family, that everyone had simply assumed there was nothing to inherit because successful people don't disguise their wealth and therefore lack of obvious wealth must mean lack of money. And my family had never asked about the estate or whether I needed help with legal fees or if there was anything significant left behind. Because I was just Emily and grandmother was just a nurse, and neither of us mattered enough to wonder about. I spent that weekend in a fog of disbelief and possibility, barely sleeping as I processed what my grandmother had done for me. And Monday morning, I called the estate lawyer whose number was on the letterhead and made an appointment for that afternoon because I needed someone to confirm this was real, that I wasn't misunderstanding something fundamental about the inheritance. And when I sat across from Patricia Morrison in her downtown office with its view of the harbor, she smiled at me with genuine warmth and said, "Your grandmother talked about you constantly, Emily. She was so proud of you." And those words made me cry again because I had missed so much time with her in her final years, too busy with teaching and too ashamed of my financial struggles to visit as often as I should have. Patricia walked me through every detail of the estate, explaining how my grandmother had started investing in pharmaceutical companies and medical device manufacturers in the 1970s, when she saw firsthand which innovations were transforming patient care, how she had recognized the value in these companies decades before most investors did, and her nursing career had given her insights that translated into extraordinary returns over time. And she had lived simply in her cottage and saved aggressively and reinvested dividends because she wanted to give me something that would matter, something that would let me live fully without fear. Patricia recommended wealth management services, and I agreed to meet with her firm's financial advisors. But what struck me most during our conversation was when she showed me a letter my grandmother had written to her, instructions about the estate that revealed how much thought had gone into this gift. And my grandmother had written, "Emily is like me. She chose meaningful work over status, purpose over profit. The family never understood us, but she deserves security and freedom to continue making that choice." And reading those words, I understood that this inheritance wasn't just money, but recognition, validation from the one person whose opinion had always mattered most to me. I left Patricia's office in a daze, walking through the cold December afternoon trying to process everything. And part of me wanted to hide this windfall, to keep it secret and avoid the inevitable drama with my family. But another part of me kept thinking about Sophia's words, that I didn't have to prove anything, but I also didn't have to hide. And I realized I was tired of making myself small to accommodate their comfort, tired of pretending my life and choices didn't have value just because they measured worth differently than I did. By the time I got home, I had made a decision. I would use this money exactly as my grandmother intended, living my values and helping others, and building something meaningful. And if my family found out and changed their behavior because of it, that would tell me everything I needed to know about what I actually meant to them versus what my bank account meant to them. I spent that evening researching the literacy program I had been dreaming about for years, the intensive intervention system that could identify struggling readers in first and second grade and provide them with the support they needed before they fell into the pattern of failure that became so hard to break. And I calculated that $50,000 would fund a pilot program at my school for 3 years, enough time to prove the concept and gather data, and hopefully secure ongoing district funding. And I decided I would name it after my grandmother, the Margaret Chen Early Literacy Initiative, because she had believed in the power of education, even when she couldn't afford to give her own children everything they wanted. And this would honor her memory in a way that aligned perfectly with both our values. Rachel's call came 3 days later while I was grading spelling tests at my kitchen table, and I saw her name on my phone screen and felt my stomach tighten because we hadn't spoken in months, and she never called unless she wanted something or had criticism to deliver wrapped in concern. I answered with a careful, "Hello," and her voice came through tight and sweet, like artificial honey, that tone she used when she was trying to extract information while pretending casual interest. And she said, I saw the most interesting article today. There must be some mistake about you donating money to your school?" I felt something shift inside me, a small straightening of my spine, and I heard myself respond with unexpected calm. "No mistake. Grandmother left me her estate. I'm using it to fund a literacy program." The silence on the other end lasted 3 full seconds before Rachel's voice came back higher and sharper. "Wait, what? Grandmother left you money? How much?" And I could hear the calculations starting already, the mental accounting of what she thought should have been family assets distributed equally, and I said simply, "Enough to make a difference for my students." And Rachel's tone shifted immediately from shock to accusation as she demanded, "Why didn't you tell the family? We had a right to know about grandmother's estate." And I felt anger rising, but kept my voice level as I responded, "Why would I tell you? We're apparently not close enough for Christmas. No place for losers, remember?" The words hung in the air between us, and I heard Rachel's sharp intake of breath, because this was the first time I had directly confronted what our mother had said, the first time I had thrown their cruelty back at them instead of absorbing it silently. And Rachel immediately started backpedaling with, "Mom was joking about that, Emily. You're being oversensitive." But I cut her off with words that felt powerful leaving my mouth. She wasn't laughing when she said it. Neither was I when I heard it. I ended the call before Rachel could respond, my hands shaking but my heart steady, and I felt something unfamiliar that I slowly recognized as empowerment, the strange sensation of standing up for myself after 29 years of bending to accommodate their comfort. Hours later, my mother called with a voice dripping false warmth, suddenly wanting to catch up and making sure I knew that, of course you're invited to Christmas, sweetheart. The family's not complete without you. And I recognized the transparent motivation immediately. The way her interest materialized exactly when my bank account became relevant, and when she asked about grandmother's estate with studied casualness, claiming she was just curious. I remained deliberately vague and said I was busy with volunteer work, and she circled back to Christmas twice more during the conversation, emphasizing how much they wanted me there, how they'd love to celebrate together. And I noted with bitter clarity that this warmth only emerged after the newspaper article revealed I had money worth noticing, that I had transformed from disappointment to asset in the span of one news cycle. I was non-committal about Christmas, saying I'd think about it, and after we hung up, my phone buzzed with a text from Marcus, my brother who hadn't initiated contact in over a year, and his message read, "Hey stranger, long time. Drink soon?" With an emoji I knew he'd never used before, and I stared at these sudden overtures of connection and saw them for exactly what they were. Not love, not family loyalty, but interest in my inheritance. And when Sophia came over that evening and I told her everything, she looked at me with fierce certainty and said, "You should go to Christmas. Let them see the real you, the person they've been dismissing all these years." And I realized she was right, that I had spent my entire life trying to earn their approval by being smaller and quieter and less demanding, and maybe it was time to show up fully as myself and let them confront what they'd been too blind to see. 2 weeks before Christmas, the formal invitation arrived in my mailbox, heavy cream cardstock with my parents' names embossed in gold, inviting me to join the family celebration at the lake house on Christmas Eve. And the formality of it struck me as absurd, given that 3 weeks earlier I had been explicitly uninvited. But I set it on my kitchen counter and stared at it while making coffee. And that same afternoon my mother called again, her third call that week, pressing for confirmation about whether I would attend, her voice carrying a brittle cheerfulness that made my teeth ache. And I told her I was still deciding, which was true because part of me wanted to avoid the whole painful charade, while another part of me recognized that showing up might be the only way to finally stand in my truth and stop hiding from their judgment. The next morning, I woke to 17 notifications on my phone and discovered that I had been added back to the family group chat, the one I had been removed from in September, and scrolling back through the history I could see exactly when my name had disappeared from the thread, right after Rachel's birthday dinner that I had not been invited to, and now suddenly the chat was full of messages ostensibly directed at everyone, but clearly performed for my benefit. With Rachel writing, "Can't wait to catch up with everyone, missed you all so much," and Marcus sharing a photo of the lake house from last Christmas with the caption "Best Family Traditions." And I felt anger rising hot in my chest at the transparency of their motives, the way they thought I would not notice or would not care that their affection materialized exactly when my bank account became relevant. I made my decision that afternoon, sitting in my classroom after the students had left, looking at the reading corner we had built together with donated books and secondhand beanbags, and I decided I would attend Christmas, but I would do it on my terms, not to show off wealth or prove anything to them, but to demonstrate through my actions what my values actually were, to let them see clearly who I had always been underneath their dismissal. And if they could not recognize or respect that, then at least I would know I had shown up authentically, and the failure was theirs, not mine. I spent the next week expanding my holiday giving, using additional funds from the inheritance to sponsor 15 families through the homeless shelter where I volunteered, providing not just Christmas gifts, but grocery vouchers and winter coats and toys for children whose parents were struggling exactly as I had watched my students' families struggle for years. And I funded a complete renovation of my school's library because our books were falling apart and our shelves were held together with duct tape, and every child deserved to walk into a space that told them reading mattered, that they mattered, and I established a scholarship fund at my grandmother's nursing school, a program that would cover tuition for students who chose meaningful work over lucrative careers, who picked purpose the way my grandmother and I had both done. And when the local news covered these donations more extensively and a television reporter called requesting an interview, I surprised myself by saying yes because I realized I was not ashamed of this wealth or how I was using it, that in fact I was proud of honoring my grandmother's legacy by living exactly as she had hoped I would. The interview took place in my classroom, surrounded by my students' artwork and their writing projects pinned to bulletin boards, and the reporter asked about my motivation for such significant philanthropy, and I spoke about my grandmother's life and values, about how she had shown me that teaching and nursing and caring professions were not lesser careers, but essential ones. And I talked with genuine pride about my students' growth and achievements, how 7-year-old Marcus had gone from barely recognizing letters to reading chapter books, how shy Maya now raised her hand eagerly to share her ideas. And when the reporter asked if my family supported my choices, I paused and then said carefully, "Not everyone understood my choices, but my grandmother did, and her belief in me made all the difference." And I saw the reporter's eyes sharpen with interest at what I was not saying, but she did not push, and I was grateful for that restraint. The television interview aired on the local evening news the week before Christmas, and I watched it alone in my apartment with a strange mixture of pride and vulnerability, seeing myself on screen talking about grandmother's legacy and the importance of investing in education, and within an hour, my phone exploded with notifications as the family group chat came alive with messages that felt performative and hollow. Rachel writing, "So proud of you, sis," even though she had never once called me sis in our entire lives. Marcus posting, "Amazing work, Em," with enthusiasm that rang false given that he had not asked about my work in years, and my parents contributing effusive praise that represented a complete reversal from every dismissive comment they had made about my teaching career. And I sat staring at these messages, feeling anger rise in my throat at how transparent they were, how their pride materialized exactly when my actions became publicly visible and financially significant. And I did not respond immediately, but let them wait, let them wonder, before finally typing a simple, "Thank you, I'll see you Christmas Eve," because I had made my decision and I would follow through regardless of how uncomfortable it would be. I spent the next few days preparing for Christmas with specific intentions, packing my small overnight bag with the same modest clothes I had always worn, deliberately choosing not to buy designer items, even though I could now afford them because that would miss the entire point of who I was and what I valued. And I included a photo album I had created with pictures of my grandmother and my students, visual evidence of the legacy I was building and the connections that mattered. And I printed out documentation of the charitable foundation I was establishing, the Margaret Chen Educational Excellence Foundation, because I wanted them to see in concrete terms how I was using this inheritance. And when Sophia came over the night before I left to help me prepare emotionally, she sat on my couch and held my hands and said, "Remember who you are, regardless of their opinion. You're going there as yourself, not as who they want you to be." And I nodded and felt strength building in my chest, a certainty that whatever happened at that lake house, I would not shrink myself to fit their expectations anymore. I would not apologize for my choices or seek their validation. I would simply stand in my truth and let them confront what they had been too blind or too cruel to see all these years. And as I drove away from my apartment the next morning, I felt nervous but determined, knowing that this Christmas would mark either a beginning or an ending, and either outcome would be honest, and honesty felt like the greatest gift I could give myself after 29 years of trying to earn love from people who measured worth in all the wrong ways. Christmas Eve dinner unfolded in the formal dining room with its elaborate table setting of fine china and crystal glasses that caught the candlelight, and I sat in the position of prominence to my father's right, where usually Rachel would be placed, a seating arrangement that would have been unthinkable at any previous family gathering, and that told me everything I needed to know about how my perceived value had shifted in their eyes. And when my father stood to offer a toast raising his wine glass with performative solemnity, he said, "To family, our greatest treasure." and the irony of those words settling over the table was not lost on me, given that just weeks earlier this same family had explicitly excluded me from their celebration, had called me a loser, had erased my name from their Christmas card as though I did not exist. And now suddenly I was treasure, because treasure was exactly what I represented to them in the most literal sense. The conversation throughout the meal kept circling back to my good fortune with the kind of persistence that made my jaw tight, my mother commenting with studied casualness that, "Your grandmother always was full of surprises. None of us had any idea she had managed to save so much." And Rachel adding with a laugh that tried to sound lighthearted but came out slightly sharp, "None of us knew she had so much saved. I mean, she lived so modestly. Who would have thought?" And beneath these observations, I heard the unspoken implication that money of this significance should not belong to just one family member, but should somehow be shared or redistributed, should be treated as a family asset rather than my personal inheritance. And when I mentioned calmly that grandmother's will had been very specific about her intentions, that she had left the money directly to me with clear instructions about how she hoped I would use it, an awkward silence fell over the table, broken only by the sound of silverware against plates. Marcus recovered first with his characteristic diplomacy, saying, "Of course she wanted you to have it. That's not what we're questioning." But then he added with a meaningful look around the table, "Family supports each other though, right? That's what we do, we help each other out." And I felt the pressure of their expectations building like a physical weight on my chest, felt them closing in with their assumptions about access to my inheritance, and Rachel launched into a discussion of investment opportunities and family partnerships that could benefit everyone, talking about real estate ventures and stock portfolios with the confident authority of someone who made six figures and thought that gave her the right to manage other people's money, while my father interjected comments about family trusts and tax advantages of collective planning, as though these were helpful suggestions rather than transparent attempts to get their hands on what grandmother had left specifically to me. I recognized the setup happening in real time, saw how they were positioning themselves to claim a stake in my inheritance while pretending to offer financial wisdom, and I remained calm and non-committal through their various proposals. And when I tried to change the subject by sharing a story about my students and their growth this semester, about how teaching them to read had opened up entire worlds for children who had struggled and doubted themselves, my family feigned polite interest for perhaps 30 seconds before their attention visibly wandered, before Rachel actually interrupted me mid-sentence to say, "That's nice, but let's talk about real financial planning, about serious money management." And those words, real financial planning, landed like a slap because they dismissed everything I cared about as trivial, reduced my students and my work to something less than real. And I felt anger rising hot and sharp, but kept my voice level when I responded, "Teaching is real. My students are real. This is what the money is for." Rachel laughed, actually laughed, and said, "You're not seriously planning to spend it all on other people's children, are you?" And my mother joined with a nervous laugh of her own, adding, "Rachel, I'm sure Emily will be sensible about this." And I looked at my mother and said clearly, "I am being sensible. Grandmother trusted me to use it meaningfully." And my father set down his wine glass with deliberate care and said, "Family is meaningful too, Emily." And in that moment, I understood that this entire evening, this invitation, this sudden warmth and interest, had never been about me at all, but only about the money they thought they could access through me. And I knew that what came next would determine whether I continued to accept their treatment or finally stood up for who I had always been. After dinner, we moved into the living room, where a fire crackled in the stone fireplace, and my father poured expensive wine into crystal glasses with the kind of casual luxury that had always characterized their lifestyle. And my mother settled into her usual chair with a brightness in her eyes that felt predatory as she suggested we have a family meeting to discuss collective planning for the future. And I recognized this moment as the confrontation I had known was coming since the moment I accepted their invitation, so I agreed calmly that yes, we should talk, and I watched Rachel position herself at the center of the room, the way she always did when she wanted to control a conversation, and she began with a tone of concern that might have sounded genuine if I did not know her so well. Saying, "We're concerned that you're being taken advantage of by these charities, Em. These organizations can be very manipulative with generous people." And I felt a flash of anger at the condescension in her voice, but kept my response level when I said, "I'm not being taken advantage of. I'm choosing to give. There's a difference." And Marcus chimed in with his diplomatic approach, saying, "It's just that $50,000 is a lot of money for a school donation. We just want to make sure you're thinking long term." And I looked at him directly and said, "It's my money. Grandmother left it to me." And the room went quiet for a moment before my father cleared his throat and said with the authoritative tone he used when he expected to be obeyed, "Technically, Emily, it's family money. Your grandmother was family. Her assets are part of the family legacy." And I felt my anger rising hot in my chest, but forced my voice to stay calm when I responded, "She left it specifically to me. The will was very clear about that. There's no ambiguity." And Rachel leaned forward with an expression of wounded reasonableness and said, "But you're not being fair. We're all her grandchildren. She loved all of us. And it seems wrong for one person to control everything." And something inside me snapped at those words, at the sheer audacity of them claiming unfairness when they had spent my entire life treating me as less than. And I heard myself say clearly and coldly, "Where was this family concern when you called me a loser, when you told me Christmas was no place for people like me?" And silence fell over the room like a physical weight. And my mother's face flushed as she said quickly, "Emily, that was a misunderstanding. I was having a bad day." And Rachel jumped in to support her with, "Mom was just upset about space limitations. You're taking it out of context." And I laughed, a sound with no humor in it, and said, "There are 8 bedrooms in this house. Space was never the limitation." And then I pulled out my phone with hands that were steady, despite the adrenaline coursing through me, and I played the voicemail I had saved, my mother's voice filling the room with perfect clarity, saying, "Emily, we've decided Christmas this year is for successful family members only. It's no place for losers." And I watched their faces as they heard it, watched them realize they had been caught in an undeniable truth. And my father's expression turned angry as he said, "You recorded that? You recorded your own mother?" And I corrected him quietly. "I saved it. There's a difference. I saved it as a reminder of how you really see me, of what you really think of my life and my choices." And my mother's eyes filled with tears, the way they always did when she was confronted with something she did not want to face. And she said, "I didn't mean it that way. You have to understand." And I looked at her and asked the question I had been holding for weeks. "How did you mean it then? Explain to me how you meant it." Because it seemed pretty clear. I stood up from my chair with a calm that felt powerful rather than fragile, and for the first time in my entire life, I commanded this room and these people who had spent 29 years making me feel small, and I said clearly, "I want to be clear about something. I didn't come here for your approval." And I walked to the mantel where family photos were displayed in expensive frames, photos that included me but had never really seen me, and I said, "Grandmother left me that money because she understood something you never did." And Rachel's voice came sharp with defensiveness. "What's that supposed to mean?" And I turned to face them all, these people who shared my blood but had never bothered to know my heart, and I said, "That worth isn't measured in salary or status, that a person's value isn't determined by how much money they make or how impressive their job title sounds." And then I began listing the specific memories that had accumulated like stones in my chest over the years. Rachel's wedding 3 years ago, where I was placed at the children's table at 26 years old. Marcus's promotion party, where my father had introduced me as our other daughter, with that dismissive tone that made me sound like an afterthought. And I said, every family dinner, every holiday gathering, every phone call, I was the disappointment, the one who didn't measure up, the failure. And my mother protested immediately with, We never said that. We never called you a failure. And I looked at her directly and said, You didn't have to say it. It was in every comparison, every dismissive comment, every time you changed the subject when I talked about my students or my work. And I reached into my bag and pulled out the Christmas card from this year, the one that had been addressed to Rachel and Marcus and their families with my name conspicuously absent, and I held it up and said, You literally erased me from the family card. And Rachel jumped in defensively with, That was a printing error, you're being ridiculous. And I pulled out my phone again and brought up the screenshots I had saved of the family group chat. Screenshots that showed clearly the date I had been removed from the conversation, September 15th, and then the date I had been added back, December 8th, 2 days after the newspaper article about my donation had been published, and I said, I was removed in September, added back 2 weeks ago, right when the news article appeared. And I watched Marcus's face because he couldn't deny the timeline, couldn't explain away the evidence I had laid out so clearly, and my father said with irritation, Emily, you're being dramatic, you're making mountains out of molehills. And I felt that old familiar pressure to back down, to apologize, to make myself smaller so they could be comfortable. But instead I said with quiet strength, No, I'm not being dramatic. I'm being honest. Finally honest, after 29 years of pretending it didn't hurt. And my mother was crying now with tears that I recognized as much about her discomfort at being confronted as about any real remorse. And she said, We love you, Emily. Of course we love you. And I looked at her and asked the question that had been building in my chest since the moment I arrived. Do you? Do you really love me? Or do you love the idea of $2.3 million in the family? And there was a collective gasp at the number, and I watched Rachel's eyes widen with shock as she said, Wait, how much? And I realized in that moment that they had assumed the $50,000 donation was most of the inheritance, had thought that was the extent of grandmother's estate, and I said clearly, Grandmother's estate was valued at $2.3 million, plus property holdings, plus an additional educational trust of $500,000. And I watched their faces change as they processed what this meant, processed the magnitude of what grandmother had accumulated and left specifically to me. The family sat stunned into silence as they processed the full magnitude of what I had just revealed, and I could see the calculations happening behind their eyes as they recalibrated everything they thought they knew about me and my situation. And Rachel recovered first the way she always did, because she was trained as a lawyer to think quickly on her feet. And she said, That's incredible, Em. We should really talk about how to manage. But I cut her off before she could finish that sentence because I knew exactly where it was going. And I said, About what? About how to divide it? About how to get your share? It's not yours. It was never yours. And my father stood up with his commanding presence that had intimidated me my entire life and said, Emily, be reasonable. That's a life-changing amount of money. You need proper advice and family support. And I looked at him with a clarity I had never felt before and said, It is life-changing, and I am changing lives with it, just not yours. And then I began detailing my plans in specific terms that made their horror grow with each word. The literacy program expansion that would serve 500 children annually, the scholarship fund that would send 20 students to college every year, the library renovations at 3 underfunded schools, and I said, I've committed $1 million already to various educational charities and programs. And my mother's face went pale as she gasped, You've given away $1 million already? Emily, that's insane. You can't just throw away money like that. And I corrected her firmly with, I haven't given it away. I've invested it in children who remind me of myself, children who are overlooked and underestimated and told they're not good enough. And Rachel stood up suddenly with her face flushed red with genuine anger now, not the calculated concern from before, and she said loudly, This is insane! You're completely insane! You're throwing away our family's money on strangers! And I felt my own anger rise to match hers as I said sharply, It was never your family's money. It was grandmother's money that she earned and saved and invested for 25 years, and now it's my money because she chose to leave it to me. specifically to me, not to the family. And Marcus tried a different approach because he was always the diplomatic one, saying, Emily, just think about your future, about retirement and security. You can't give away everything and expect to be okay. And I looked at him and said, I have thought about it. I've thought about it very carefully, and I'm keeping enough for security and for my dreams. And then I revealed what I had not yet told them, that I had already purchased my own house with part of the inheritance, a small 3-bedroom bungalow in the neighborhood where I taught, close to my school and my students, and I watched their faces register confusion because they could not understand why anyone with nearly $3 million would choose a modest house in a working-class neighborhood when they could afford a mansion. And my mother said, But Emily, you could buy something so much nicer, somewhere better. And I said simply, I don't need something nicer. I don't need somewhere better. I need a home. And that's what I bought. And my father's face was red now as he said, Your grandmother would want you to be smart with this money, to invest it properly, to build real wealth. And I felt a surge of power as I reached into my bag and pulled out grandmother's letter, the one she had written to me before she died. And I said, Grandmother was smart with this money for 25 years. She built it from almost nothing into nearly $3 million, and she trusted me with it. And then I began reading portions of her letter aloud, her words about how she had watched me choose a path of purpose over a path of prestige, how she had seen in me the same values she had held her entire life, how she knew I would use the money not to elevate myself above others, but to lift others up. And I read her final words. Emily, you have always seen people that others overlook. You have always valued hearts over bank accounts, and that is why I trust you with everything I have built. And I looked up from the letter with tears in my eyes and said, She saw me, really saw me, understood who I am and what matters to me, something none of you ever bothered to do. I continued speaking because once I had started telling the truth, I found I could not stop, and I said, You want to know what's funny? Even now, after everything I've said, you still don't see me. You don't see who I am or what matters to me. All you see are dollar signs and an asset to manage, not a person with feelings and dreams. And Rachel said with frustration clear in her voice, That's not fair, Emily. We're trying to help you. We're your family and we want what's best for you. And I felt something sharp and bitter rise in my throat as I said, Help me? You want to talk about helping me? Where was that help when I was struggling with student loans and working 2 jobs just to make rent? And I turned to look directly at my father and said, I asked you for advice 3 years ago. I came to you because I thought maybe you'd understand. And you told me to get a real job if I wanted to stop struggling. And my father shifted uncomfortably in his chair and said, That's not exactly what I said. You're twisting my words. But I shook my head and said, No, it's exactly what you meant. You made it clear that teaching wasn't a real career in your eyes. And then I turned to Marcus and said, You loaned Rachel $30,000 for her condo down payment. I remember because she talked about it at Thanksgiving that year, and Marcus's face went pale because he knew where this was going, and I continued. I asked to borrow $3,000 for a car repair, just $3,000 that I promised to pay back with interest, and you said no. And Marcus said defensively, Rachel paid me back, she had a payment plan. And I said quietly, I would have paid you back too. I would have done whatever payment plan you wanted. But I wasn't worth the risk, was I? I wasn't a good investment. And my mother said with her voice breaking, Emily, we didn't realize you needed help. If we had known you were struggling so much, we would have done something. And I laughed then, a bitter sound that didn't feel like it came from me, and I said, I told you so many times, but you didn't listen because you weren't interested in my life. And then I began listing the specifics of my financial struggles over the years. How I had eaten ramen noodles for weeks at a time to afford textbooks. How I had worked as a waitress every summer and winter break. How every piece of furniture in my apartment was second-hand or from thrift stores. How I had worn the same coat for 6 years because I couldn't afford a new one. And I said, all of this was happening while you were taking European vacations and buying investment properties and renovating this house. And not once did any of you think to ask if I was okay. And Rachel said with an edge to her voice, You could have been clearer about your situation. You could have actually asked for help instead of just hinting." And I looked at her with clear eyes and said, "I shouldn't have had to be clearer. You should have cared enough to ask. You should have been interested enough in my life to notice I was struggling, but you weren't, because I was just the disappointing daughter who chose a worthless career." And the silence that fell over the room then was heavy and suffocating, and I bent down and picked up my purse and my coat and said, "I'm leaving now. I only came here to say this in person because you deserve to hear it face to face." And my mother stood up quickly and said, "You're leaving? Emily, it's Christmas Eve. You can't just leave." And I looked at her and said with a calmness I truly felt, "Christmas is for family, real family, for people who value each other and care about each other, and right now I have real family waiting for me, children at the shelter who actually appreciate my presence and don't measure my worth in dollars." And my father's voice rose as he said, "This is ridiculous, Emily. Sit down and stop being so dramatic." But I walked toward the door and said over my shoulder, "No, I've sat down and stayed quiet for 29 years, and I'm done with that now." I walked toward the front door with my purse and coat in my hands, and behind me I could hear chairs scraping against hardwood floors as my family rose and followed me, their voices overlapping in protests and objections that blended together into a noise that I no longer needed to parse for meaning. And my mother reached the door first and grabbed my arm with a grip that was surprisingly strong and said, "Please, Emily, please, let's talk about this tomorrow when everyone has calmed down." And I looked down at her hand on my arm and then gently removed it, not yanking away, but deliberately lifting her fingers one by one. And I said, "There's nothing to talk about, not tomorrow or any other day, not until something fundamental changes." And Rachel pushed past Marcus and said with an edge of desperation in her voice that I had never heard before, "You're going to regret this, Emily. You're really going to regret cutting off your family over money." And I stopped in the doorway and turned to face her directly and said with absolute calm, "I'm not cutting you off over money, Rachel. You cut me off before any money was involved. You cut me off every time you dismissed my career and my choices and my life. I'm just not pretending anymore that we're close when we're not." And Marcus stepped forward with his hands raised in a placating gesture and said, "So that's it? You're too good for us now? You get some money and suddenly we're not worth your time?" And I felt a sad smile cross my face as I looked at my brother, who had once been my childhood playmate before family dynamics and parental expectations had turned us into strangers. And I said, "I was always good enough, Marcus. I was always worth your time. You just never noticed." And then I stepped outside into the cold December air that hit my face like a shock of clarity, and I turned back one last time to see them framed in the doorway with the warm light from inside creating halos around their silhouettes. And it struck me as a perfect image of what I was leaving behind, a house that looked warm from the outside, but had always been cold at its heart. And I walked to my old Honda and got inside and started the engine. And in my rearview mirror I could see them still standing there, my mother crying with her hands covering her face, my father standing rigid with his arms crossed, Rachel and Marcus arguing with each other and gesturing toward my departing car. And I felt something I had not expected to feel in this moment, not triumph or vindication or even anger, but relief, a deep and profound liberation from decades of trying to earn love that had always been conditional on meeting standards I could never reach. And I drove away from the lake house and toward the homeless shelter where I had volunteered to serve Christmas Eve dinner. And when I walked through the doors, Sophia was there setting up tables with red and green tablecloths, and she looked up and saw my face and immediately came over and hugged me tight, and she said, "How did it go?" And I said, "Exactly as expected, and I'm okay. I'm really okay." And I spent the evening with families who had so much less than my family in material terms, but so much more in the ways that actually mattered. And I played with children who laughed and hugged me and didn't care what I did for a living or how much money I had. And a little girl named Maya with braids tied with red ribbons looked up at me in my nice dress that I had worn to my family's dinner and asked, "Are you a princess?" And I knelt down to her level and said, "No, sweetie, I'm a teacher, which is even better than a princess." And Maya's eyes went wide and she said, "Can I be a teacher too when I grow up?" And I felt my heart swell as I said, "You can be anything you want to be, anything at all." And in that moment of pure connection, I understood with perfect clarity why my grandmother had given me this money. Not so I could impress people, or buy their approval, or elevate myself above others, but so I could impact lives and create opportunities and see the light in children's eyes when they realized someone believed in them. Christmas morning arrived with pale winter sunlight filtering through the curtains of my new house, the small two-bedroom cottage that I had purchased 3 weeks earlier and moved into just days before Christmas. And I woke feeling something I had not felt in years. A sense of peace that came from sleeping in a space that was truly mine, chosen by me, paid for with money that represented my grandmother's faith in me, rather than anyone else's judgment of my worth. And I lay there for a moment, looking at the simple white ceiling and thinking about how different this Christmas was from every other one I had known, how I was waking up alone, but not lonely, in a modest house but not wanting, with a family that had rejected me but no longer needing their approval, and my phone on the nightstand showed 7 missed calls and a dozen text messages, some from my mother with words like, "Please call," and "We need to talk," and "I'm so sorry." Some from Rachel that ranged from apologetic to defensive to angry. One from Marcus that simply said, "I'm trying to understand." And one from my father that said nothing except, "Christmas isn't the same without you." And I looked at these messages with a curious detachment, not out of spite or vindictiveness, but because I had moved beyond the place where their words could hurt me or heal me. I had found my own center. And I set the phone down without responding, because I needed this day to be about peace rather than reconciliation, about my choices rather than their belated attempts at connection. And the doorbell rang at 9 o'clock, and I pulled on my robe and went downstairs to find a delivery person with an enormous bouquet of winter flowers, white roses, and red carnations, and evergreen sprigs. And the card read, "From your school family. Thank you for believing in us when no one else did." Signed by Principal Morrison, and what looked like 24 student names in various handwriting styles, some careful and neat, others enthusiastic scrawls, and I felt tears spring to my eyes as I set the flowers on my small kitchen table, because this was what family looked like, people who saw your worth and celebrated it. And 20 minutes later, another delivery arrived, this time an envelope containing a formal invitation to a district recognition ceremony in January, where I would be honored for the literacy program I had funded. And I held the heavy cardstock and thought about how strange it was that the recognition I had never sought was coming from everywhere except the people whose approval I had spent 29 years chasing. And then at 10 o'clock, Sophia arrived with a carrier of coffee and a bag of pastries from the bakery near school, and we sat together by my small Christmas tree that I had decorated with simple ornaments and strings of white lights, nothing expensive or elaborate, just cheerful in mine. And Sophia looked at me with concern in her eyes and said, "Any regrets about last night?" And I took a long moment to think about her question, because I wanted to answer honestly, and finally I said, "About the money and what I'm doing with it? No, not even a little bit. But about my family? Yes and no. I regret not standing up for myself sooner. I regret letting them make me feel small for so long. But I don't regret walking away last night, because that was the first truly honest moment we've ever had." And Sophia nodded and said, "Do you think you'll reconcile with them eventually?" And I cupped my warm coffee mug in both hands and said, "Maybe someday, if they can learn to see me as I am instead of as a bank account or a disappointment. But I'm not waiting for that anymore. I'm not putting my life on hold hoping they'll change." And then we exchanged gifts, simple things we had chosen thoughtfully for each other. And I gave Sophia a donation certificate in her name to a national teachers' charity. $5,000 that would fund classroom supplies for teachers in underserved schools. And Sophia gave me a framed photograph that made me cry the moment I saw it. A picture she had taken without my knowledge of me sitting in my classroom surrounded by students, all of us bent over books, and she had written on the back, "This is what success looks like." And I held that frame and cried because she was right. This was my family. These children who came to school hungry for knowledge and attention, and someone who believed in them. And later that afternoon, I drove to the children's hospital, where I had arranged to volunteer, reading Christmas stories to sick kids who couldn't go home for the holiday. And while I was there, the hospital administrator found me and mentioned that they were planning to build a new pediatric library with some recent donations. And would I be interested in contributing? And I said yes immediately, and asked if I could name it in honor of my grandmother, the Margaret Chen Memorial Library. And when I explained that my grandmother had been a nurse who believed in the power of education and kindness, the administrator's eyes grew wet, and she said it would be perfect. And the day ended quietly with me back in my small house, sitting at my desk with my journal open, and I wrote, "Grandmother didn't just leave me money, she left me permission to value myself, to stop waiting for them to see my worth and start living it." And as I finished writing, my phone rang, and I saw it was my mother. And I hesitated with my hand hovering over the phone, because I knew that answering would open a door that might lead anywhere. But finally I picked up and said, "Hello," and my mother's voice came through small and uncertain, so different from her usual confident tone, and she said, "Emily, I'm sorry. I'm really truly sorry." And I said simply, "Okay," and she said, "Can we start over? Can we try to have a real relationship?" And I thought about what that would mean, whether she was capable of seeing me differently, whether I wanted to invest the energy in rebuilding something that had been broken for so long. And I said, "We can start honest. If you're ready for that, we can try to build something real instead of pretending everything was fine." And the conversation was brief and careful. No promises made, no grand declarations of changed hearts, just a tentative possibility hanging in the air between us. And when I hung up, I felt not triumph or vindication, but peace. A deep, quiet peace that came from knowing I had changed even if they hadn't. And I sat down at my desk where an envelope from the estate lawyer waited, and I opened it to find the final paperwork for the foundation I had established, officially registered and approved, the Margaret and Emily Chen Foundation for Educational Excellence, my grandmother's legacy and mine intertwined forever. And I smiled as I read through the documents because I finally understood with perfect clarity what she had been trying to teach me, that I was never a loser, I was never a disappointment. I had just been playing a different game than my family, measuring success by different standards, and by those standards, the ones that actually mattered to me, I had won.